Okay, while people take our seats for tonight, I'm going to start with just a couple who, what, when, where things that everyone needs to know. Like, if anyone needs a bathroom, the bathrooms are out that way. Go out through here and bear to your left, and they're not that far once you go down that corridor. So if you need that, a little bit with regard to that, the way our schedule is going to go. First off, by the way, my name is Elmer Dengler, and the only reason why I'm coordinating this is because, one, I had a passion for trying to do these sort of things for the last 20 years on my own property. And part of that came from when I was 12 years old, I got involved with the Monarch butterfly and was actually involved with tagging and actually did some of the original research as a 12-year-old boy. So a citizen scientist, true citizen scientist, that finally discovered where the monarchs went in Mexico under Dr. Uquart out of the University of Toronto. So I have a passion for what these folks are going to talk about. All my life I've had that passion, and so I'm very happy to be able to coordinate that between some things that I do on pollinators in the green team, and then also vice versa, having those plants available through the Bowie Crofton Garden Club. That's kind of why I'm focusing on this tonight. What we'll do, the schedule is going to be, we're going to first start with Desiree, who's worked under Dr. Doug Talamay, and also has done this wonderful neighborhood project that we'll hear a lot of details about. And then we'll have a break in the middle, so you can check out our booths. We have a lot of wonderful things going on in Bowie environmentally, and particularly connected to some of the things you'll hear tonight. And you'll have opportunity to visit with some of the people that are working on those things for the green team. And you'll also hear about opportunities to get some of the plants that we'll be talking about in general, and the overall arching issue of bringing back native plants onto our properties, which will really bring back the wildlife and stabilize a lot of declining populations of lots of things. So that's our immediate schedule. We go into the second speaker, and then we'll have questions at the very end. Have plenty of time to ask any type of involved question you want, because those are the ones that are really good. And last year we had so many great questions with Dr. Talamay, and I think that's really the core of what we want to do. We want to probe and go to the next level of what we can do in helping our environment. This is a hands-on thing. This is so beautiful about what we're going to hear about tonight. It's a hands-on thing. Okay, without any further ado, I'm going to start very briefly, and I do brief introductions to the speakers. I prefer to have them say what they want you to know, because sometimes it can be embarrassing, or sometimes it isn't focused on what their passions are. And all I know is that when I first talked with Desiree and heard that she was the researcher who was doing some actual work right in this region, I said, we have got to have her speak. I don't care what we do, we need to know about what this study has found out, because it's local and it's real, and it involves citizen scientists. Each of us can play that valuable role. We sometimes look to somebody else to do it. This is something we can do. We can do in our own backyards. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Desiree Narango, and she can say her background, her interests, and anything else she wants to share.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for that. Thank you for that great introduction. So I'm really excited, especially excited to talk about my PhD research with you today, because like Elmer said, many of these, well, not many, but a few dozen of these yards actually took place here in Bowie, Maryland, and Bowie was a great place to do research. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my PhD work at University of Delaware and some of the stuff that Chickadees have told us about our gardening. So before I started my PhD, I did my master's in Columbus, Ohio, and we were interested in how invasive plants were affecting breeding birds. And so we were working in these tiny little forest fragments right here. But the whole time I was there, we were completely ignoring everything else that was around these little forest fragments. And so I couldn't help but wonder, like, what's going on in all these residential areas? And truthfully, scientists aren't really looking at these areas. So I was fortunate to get in contact with Dr. Doug Tallamy at University of Delaware and Dr. Peter Mera, who's at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center here in DC. And they invited me to join this cool new project to start looking at the features in people's backyards and how it was affecting food resources for breeding birds. And many of you might know Doug Tallamy already. He's an entomologist at University of Delaware, and he wrote the book Bringing Nature Home, where he talked a lot about his research and how native plants are better able to support our native bugs and other arthropods. And so he posited that if these native plants support more bugs, then that's great for food webs, especially things like insectivorous birds. But truthfully, even though Doug had said that, no one had actually tested any of these questions, and so that's where I come in. So my research looks at a lot of different things. Insect availability, so the food for birds, bird behavior, populations, communities, and also looking at energy transfer through the food webs. But I'm not going to talk about all of it, but if you want to talk to me about it later, I'd be glad to share. But today I'm just going to talk to you about the bugs, the behavior, and the populations. So why would non-native plants, plants that aren't related to our native ecosystems, why would they affect bugs? So I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with monarch butterflies who feed exclusively on milkweed. What a lot of folks don't know is that over 90% of the herbivores, the bugs that eat plants, are specialists to some degree. So things like this double-toothed prominent feeds only on elms, which it can sequester the nasty stuff that's in plants, but it also looks really nice and can camouflage in really well. And so, you know, as a gardener, there's a lot of butterflies and moths that you can provide nectar resources for them, but you also need to provide the food, the host plants for the caterpillars as well. So things like this hackberry emperor, it only feeds on hackberry trees. Spicebush swallowtail only feeds on spicebush and sassafras. So if you plant those in your garden, you're going to get those butterflies. You're going to get those females coming in to lay eggs. The zebra swallowtail is my favorite butterfly, and the only thing that they'll use is pawpaw. Eastern tiger swallowtail is actually what's kind of considered a generalist. And by generalist, it only feeds on a handful of plants, so things like tulip tree, cherries, hop tree. Snowberry clearwing is a moth, not a hummingbird or a butterfly, and they really love phlox for nectar. But if you want to have caterpillars, you need to have snowberry or dogbane. This imperial moth here, really, God, it's a really beautiful moth, right? So imperial moths, they'll use only a handful of different deciduous trees in the area. So here's my question to you. How many caterpillars do you think are how many caterpillar species do you think are present in the state of Maryland? Anybody want to guess? 600. Anyone else? It's higher. Okay, I'll give it away. At least 2,478 different species of caterpillars. You were close, but not that close. So of the 2,400, 30% of those caterpillars only feed on one species of plant. And so if you don't have that species in your yard, you're not going to get that caterpillar. 88% of them feed on less than 5 plants, which 5 plants, you're like, oh, that's a good deal. That's a lot of plants, right? But if you think about, I don't know, I looked this up earlier. I think there's like 4,200 different plant species in the state of Maryland. So if you think about it, 5 is less than 1% of everything that it could feed on. So still very specialist. And so, you know, what Doug had found when he went into the host plant literature, which is scientists go out and they're like, oh, I found a caterpillar on this plant. It must feed on this. He went and looked at all that host plant literature, and he found that the number of species that had been recorded on native plants was way, way higher than the non-native species. So clearly the native plants have the potential to support a lot of biodiversity. Here's just kind of a snapshot. These are numbers that are specific to Maryland. So if you plant an oak, you could potentially support 506 different caterpillar species. Cherries are 398, maples 279. And then when we go to the other end, there's some non-native plants. So things like ginkgo is an Asian plant. It's very popular ornamental. It only has 6. And actually, honestly, probably some of those 6 are mistakes, because scientists make mistakes sometimes. Bamboo is horrible in Maryland. But you could get 1 caterpillar, 1 caterpillar species. Snowbell 1, Zelkova 0, Cryptomeria 0. A lot of them are 0. But what does this mean for the consumers, our birds? If there's just 1 species of caterpillar, does it matter if there's lots of them? A bird doesn't care what kind of caterpillar it is. They're just looking for food. And most of the terrestrial birds rely on insects and other arthropods, at least in some point during the annual cycle. And for many of these insectivores, caterpillars are disproportionately important for them because they have really high protein, they have really high carotenoids, which is for immune function. It's high biomass. It's a real meaty food item. And so, but nobody had really asked the question, are non-native plants affecting food resources for birds? Oops. Oh, something came out. So that's the overarching question of my dissertation, is to really to look at that, whether there are consequences to the non-native plants that we have in our backyards. So I work in a project called Neighborhood Nest Watch, which is a citizen science program in the DC metropolitan area. This is not all of my yards, but it gives you an idea of how spread out they are in the area. And in each one of these yards, we collected a whole lot of information. In some yards, we collected information about bug food that was there, the diets of the birds, behavior, populations, how well they were doing, all kinds of stuff. In Neighborhood Nest Watch, like I said, it's been going on for 17 years. And then my project started in 2013, and from 2013 to 16, we worked in over 200 yards in this area. And if you Google Neighborhood Nest Watch, you can find out about some of the other cool projects that they have going on. So for most of my work, I focused on the Carolina chickadee. They are a small insectivorous bird that's very common in urban areas. A fun fact is that Native Americans used to consider the chickadee the bird of truth and a bird that would bring good fortune. And so I think it's kind of serendipitous that I ended up working with this bird, because this is the bird that's telling us the truth about what is going on in our residential areas. But the most important thing about this species is that over 90% of their diet is things like spiders, caterpillars, aphids, and other insects. So they could be potentially affected by non-native plants. So in each one of these yards, this is an example one here, we put up this chickadee nest box. It's a nesting tube to try to attract them to the area and encourage them to nest so that we could study them. But they didn't always use our tubes. Sometimes They use some really funny areas too. So this is one that made a nest in a mailbox for 3 years in a row. They really wanted to nest in that area. So in these yards, we wanted to really quantify what the plant community was like, not just in the homeowner's yard that we were working in. So here the star is where the nest box is. So we were working with this person. But birds don't operate at the scale of a single yard. They use a neighborhood. So we also had to make friends here and here and here and here so that we could really collect information about what kind of plants were in the area. And so when we looked at it, there was a lot of variation. So we documented over 350 different woody plant species. So we're just collecting information on trees and shrubs, because for birds, the flowers and stuff don't provide quite as much food. There was a lot of diversity, but most importantly, there was a lot of variation in the exotic or the non-native plants, from less than 1% up to 99%. And so when people think about non-natives, a lot of times they think about aggressive, invasive species like this tree of heaven, but this is not what these yards look like. These are highly managed properties where the majority of the plant biomass that's there is because either the homeowner planted it or they decided to leave it behind. So a lot of decisions that are being made on what plants are here. So our first question really is, do native plants have more bug food for these chickadees? And so what we found is that, yes, the number translates into the number, the amount of food that's available as well. So we found significantly more biomass of caterpillars on native species versus non-natives. And this was also true for what are called congeneric species. So these are non-native plants that are not from North America, but are related to our species. So for example, Kwanzan cherry, which is in bloom right now, even though it's related to cherry, even though it should be very similar for cherry specialists, we found that they were supporting 40% fewer caterpillars compared to the native version. So if you have a choice on a native black cherry or a non-native version, you should go for the native if you want bird food. And me and Doug are working on something right now where we're actually finding that the plants that are the real power players to provide lots of caterpillars for birds are kind of consistent from state to state. And so there's about 20 species that support a ton of different caterpillars and lots of them. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff out there, so native and non-native. And that's something that we're working on now to see if these trees are actually keystone species for our ecosystems. So the next question is, do chickadees prefer native plants for foraging? So are they accurately assessing food availability? So for this question, we let the chickadees tell us what they want. So we use a technique called color banding. So see these little plastic bands? So we actually catch the birds. We put these very, very small color bands. The bird doesn't notice them. But what that allows scientists to do is to be able to identify that bird with our binoculars without catching him again. So so if our chickadees were breeding in the yards, we'd put our color bands on, and I can say, oh, blue over yellow aluminum, he is associated with this nest. Let's go see what kind of trees he likes to feed in. And this is, if you've never seen bird banding before, actually the National Zoo is starting a program so that you can go there and see it in action. But it's basically, we put up these nets that the bird can't see, and they fly in, and then we've been specifically trained to be able to extract them safely to collect the information we need. So this is an example of one of my chickadees. Here the star is where the nest was, and you can see that it really takes a neighborhood to raise a chickadee. They use a lot of different areas, but there's a lot of areas that they're completely avoiding, even though there are plants there for them to forage on. So here at number 1 was an American elm. Here at number 2 were a bunch of willow oaks that were along the street. We also, this pair liked to go to a black cherry, a black walnut, a black locust, and those were the most popular ones for this particular pair. So we did this for 60 different pairs in the DC metropolitan area. And so basically, what were these birds avoiding? It's basically the non-native species. So we found that the number that this here is foraging preference, so the higher the number, the more that chickadees prefer to forage on that plant. And it's strongly related to the number of caterpillar species that are found on that plant. So the more caterpillars that a tree has, the more they prefer it. That makes sense. And it's really strong for native species, not so strong for non-native species. And really what we found is that for the most part, these non-native plants aren't really functioning as foraging trees for chickadees at all. They overwhelmingly avoided them in every single yard that we studied. Oh, except for one. There was one yard where they used them, and they used crab apples and things that had a particular high number of caterpillars. But most of the non-native plants, the ones that are truly not native to this area and not related to anything else here, are down here on this end of the spectrum, and they're basically avoided. So these were the top trees that chickadees were choosing. Number 1 was native oaks, which for Maryland, they support 506. They also chose native maples, native cherries, native elm, and native hickory were the top 5 species that our birds chose to forage in. But you know, when we were following these birds around, I noticed very quickly that they weren't the only birds that are foraging in these trees. And in fact, we documented, I think, 60 different migratory birds that were using suburban yards. At least 15 different species of warbler, even in downtown DC. And the yards that my chickadees were choosing to forage in were also being chosen by a large variety of migratory birds who are feeding exclusively on insects for 100% of the year. And so it really points out the importance of even our backyards to migratory bird conservation in general. Because species every year are making these huge leaps from the boreal north of Canada all the way down to Central and South America to winter. But they can't make that in one jump. They have to stop over and gain essential fuel to make that huge journey. And during that time, I guarantee you they're stopping in your yard if your yard has food in it. And there's actually a study that came out recently that found that our artificial lights are attracting migratory birds into urban areas. And so I gotta say, if we're gonna attract them to the area, we gotta provide food for them once they get here. So the take home from that section is really that non-native plants do have less food for insectivorous birds, and chickadees are strongly preferring to forage in native trees over non-native. So moving on to the breeding information, this is kind of a fun thing I stole from Doug. So if you've seen his talks, you've seen this before. But how many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? It's a lot. So a study from the 60s found that chickadees were bringing from 390 to 570 caterpillars per day. And these chickadees have nests for at least 16 days. So if you add that up, that's from 6,000 to 9,000 single caterpillars for just one nest, for just one bird that only weighs 10 grams. That's like 10 paper clips. So if you're a much bigger bird, you probably need a lot more caterpillars. But for my research, the question I asked was, well, what if they can't find that that many. Are there consequences for birds that are breeding in areas with more non-native plants? Which is what I just said. So how do you monitor bird populations? Well, you need some key information. You need to know how well are they reproducing? Did they decide to nest in this yard? If they nested, how many eggs did they lay? How well are the adults surviving from year to year? And also how well are the juveniles surviving once they leave the nest? So there's a lot of modeling and stuff that goes in this, but that's boring. But basically what we found is that our non-native yards, the chickadees were less likely to occupy them, so they were less likely to even be there in the first place. If they were in the yard, they were less likely to breed, or they were less likely to attract a female to nest. They also were laying, on average, fewer eggs. If they laid eggs, their nests were less likely to survive. And if that nest survived, they were fledging fewer young. Not drastically so. It's the difference between fledging 6 young and fledging like 4 or 5 young. But if you're a 10-gram bird that only lives a couple of years, you only get a couple of chances. And so if we think about lifetime success, that 1 to 2 individuals could make a big difference. We also did some work to look at juvenile survival. We looked at adult survival. We found no difference, likely because everyone has bird feeders. Juvenile survival was something else. We followed family groups around to see what trees they were foraging in and how well the young were surviving. We were the first people to do this for chickadees, which was quite exciting. And so the first thing that we realized was, oh, crap, the area that we monitored for plants is not the area that they're using. So they actually used a really wide area up to 1 kilometer away from the nesting site. And interestingly, for this pair, this is in Greenbelt, Maryland, they completely avoided the forest. That's what I thought that they would do. I thought they would just take their young and be like, I'm out of here. I'm going where there's food. I'm going to the forest. The pairs that went to the forest were not successful, and only a few of them did. For the most part, they stuck to the neighborhoods, used exclusively ornamental trees. In fact, these couple of points over here is a gas station. And let me tell you, when you're out with your binoculars at a gas station, looking around saying, oh, people are coming up asking you, are you okay? What are you looking for? I'm just looking for my birds up here. So anyway, so that was interesting. But we were able to get some information about how well the young were surviving overall. And so when we plug in all that information, we found that this is population growth. So this is how well this population is replacing itself from year to year. And unfortunately, this is a little light. But we found that for the most part, only the yards that were less than 10% non-native plant biomass had sustainable populations. But we're scientists, so we're very mathy, and we wanted to figure out how certain we were in those estimates, because there is definitely uncertainty here. And so you can't see it, unfortunately, but the uncertainty stops overlapping replacement at 30% non-native plants. So this is telling us that actually, if you want to have non-native plants in your yard, it's okay. If you want a beautiful Japanese maple, that's totally fine. I love that species. But once you get up to 30% of the plant biomass in your yard, that's when you start to see consequences for insectivorous birds. And chickadees are pretty flexible. They're an urban adapter. So 30% is our suggestion for the absolute max. So if you want to provide habitat for more specialists, birds, like our migratory birds, you're going to have to aim for lower than that. But really, so in the DC area, our average was about 50% non-native plant biomass, which it actually isn't that bad. So if you really think about it, 30% is kind of just a gentle nudge in the right direction. If we had each parcel of land aim for 30%, that's not that much work. But for places like in Delaware, where a lot of our old farmland is being converted into new developments, non-native plant biomass is more like 75 and 80%. So those are the areas that are really, it's going to be a lot more effort to try to improve these landscapes for biodiversity. So the last question that I am going to talk to you about today is, for our birds that did nest and got to nestlings, was there any consequences to the diet that the nestlings were getting? And if there's changes to diet, are there effects on nestling condition as well? So for this species, Carolina chickadees, during the breeding season, 90% of their diet is insects, but they're pretty flexible. So they can eat things like caterpillars, they can eat things like spiders. This is an adult moth. This is a whole mess load of aphids. There's probably foraging on somebody's hydrangeas or something. And I can't tell. I think this is a grasshopper or a tree cricket down here. But anyway, so they can forage on a lot of different things. But each one of these food items has different amounts of nutrition, different amounts of protein, different biomass. So are their diets changing? We used video techniques to look at this. So we set up a video camera at these nests, and then we put nice little perches in front so that the bird would pose for us. Like, I got a caterpillar. We found that for the most part, these chickadees are foraging primarily on caterpillars and spiders when they're feeding their nestlings, which makes sense because both caterpillars and spiders are really, really high in protein, which is great for nestlings that are growing their bones. It's essential for them. But we found that as non-native plants increased, so as we get more non-native plant biomass, these chickadees are feeding fewer caterpillars to their young and instead feeding more spiders. Spiders are great, but for the most part, their biomass is a lot smaller than a big, delicious caterpillar. So that meant there was more work for the adults. So we found that when non-native plant biomass was high, the birds were visiting the nest more often, which gives you the impression like, oh, they're finding lots of food, everything's going great. But no, no, no. They're actually working really, really hard for not a lot of reward. And we actually, it was a big difference too, where like in some yards they were visiting twice an hour, and in other yards they were visiting like 25 times an hour. So it's a big difference in the amount of effort that these parents are putting in. I also want to mention that we also documented that some of these adults were feeding birdseed to their young, which is a big no-no. It was very rare, so it's not as if these birds seed birdseed and they're like, oh, I gotta feed this to my young. But we do think that in some of these yards where there just wasn't a lot of food at all, that they were so desperate that was the only thing that was available for them to feed. I don't even think that's been documented before, actually. So if their diets are changing, does that have any effect on the nestlings? We did find an effect as well. So this is days in the nest. The average, or the minimum that they stay in the nest is 16 days. So here in our non-native yards, birds were staying in the nest longer than the ones that were in the native yards. And then we also saw that they were in poorer condition, which means they were a smaller mass when they were in the non-native yards, and they also had slower feather growth. So this is an example here of two birds that are at day 12, and you can see that this one's eyes are open and bright. This one's eyes are still a little bit closed, and the feathers just haven't grown out quite as much. Chickadees are actually, you know, they're in a nest box. They're in a cavity in a tree. So it's okay that they stay a little bit longer. And the reason that they're staying longer is because they don't leave the nest until they can fly. So unlike other bird species like cardinals and things. So in the end, this bird was okay. I mean, we don't know if it survived after it left the nest, but for the most part, it stayed in long enough. But it does beg the question that for a lot of the bird species that make open cup nests, like cardinals and catbirds, they don't get to have that flexibility. They go to 8 days or 9 days, and then they're out. And that's why you see them like flopping around like, oh, somebody feed me, I can't fly, you know? So there's probably more consequences to those species as well if they're not finding enough food. So our take home from that section, this is a paper we have in review now, that yards with more non-native plant biomass produce fewer young overall in those populations. They're not producing as many young to support the population. But those nestlings in those non-native yards are also getting lower quality food, more spiders, fewer caterpillars, and those nestlings are in poor condition. And that's most of my work to date, but there's a lot of other stuff that we've done, and I'd be happy to talk to you about that later. But here's, if I have a little bit of time, here's some additional info if you'd like it. So this is the National Wildlife Federation website. So you remember how I told you about that host plant database, how many caterpillars are on each plant? We have that information for you, and it's relevant to your yard no matter what state that you live in. And you can go to this website here. It has all of Doug's information, and you can look at different trees that you're interested in and see which ones support the most caterpillars and, by proxy, bird food. You can also go to the Audubon Society website. They have a lot of information about native plants that you can plant in your yard, although they don't have Doug's caterpillar information. There's also a website called Habitat Network that's through the Nature Conservancy, and they have a lot of cool information about plants that you can landscape with, but they also have a lot of information about other things that you can do in your yard, like conserving leaf litter or how to have a water source, and it's just like a wealth of all kinds of other fun information for you. That's at yardmap.org. And then my last plug is for a citizen science project that Doug and one of his other PhD students are doing, and it's called whatdobirds.eat.com. Because the truth is, we don't have a lot of information about what birds eat. So if you're a photographer, if you like bugs, if you like birds, if you like being outside, if you can get a picture of a bird with a bug in its mouth, you should send it to Doug. And I should have made this bigger, but the website is just whatdobirds.eat.com. We'll take any picture. And it's a really cool data set that we're accumulating. So our evidence so far is that to support insect and bird biodiversity, homeowners should really prioritize native insect-producing plant tree species and shrub species. But the most important thing, I think the most important information that we've gathered is that your yard really matters. Your yard is not just a tiny little piece of property with some pretty plants on it that doesn't matter. It really matters a lot, especially for our insectivorous birds. And so the small changes that you make in your yard can really cascade up to have really big impacts on the surrounding ecosystem. With that, I want to acknowledge especially my Nest Watch participants, anyone that's here. Thank you so much for being a part of this project, because none of this would be possible without the amazing people that gave me access to their yards for this. It was truly a monumentous, it was just crazy that we had so many people that wanted to be, that helped me with this project. I want to thank all my field techs and my volunteers, my lab support, of course my funding sources for giving me money to do this. And with that, I'll take any questions that you have. Well, actually, I won't take questions. I'll take them later. So thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, our second speaker, and a little bit of history on how I found this. I'm a Facebook nut, and that doesn't mean I'm looking at people and trying to find dating, and that's not what Facebook is about. But recently, there were some things posted about migratory dragonflies. And I read that and I said, that is really cool. And I tend to burrow deep when I see something like that. And that's where I found Dara Satterfield, because it was her article. And it was really, from there I decided, you know, this is another person we need to try to pursue to have at our program that we were putting together. And so that's how I ran into Dara. And I really do appreciate someone who covers a wide venue of things, from dragonflies to monarch butterflies to lots of other things she's going to talk about. And at that point, I am going to ease out, and it's all yours.
I want to make sure everybody can hear me. So, how is that? Pretty good? Okay. You can't hear me?
Oh, it's covered by yours.
One second. Is that better? Is that okay?
Yes.
I'll try to stand in the middle and talk loudly. So good evening. I'm very excited to be here. We've been talking about this event for months, so it's fun to finally be here. I'm Dara Satterfield. I'm based at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, and I'm going to talk tonight about butterflies and moths. But before I do, I just wanted to start by thanking all of you for being here and for your interest in conserving Maryland's wildlife and plants. Whether you're here tonight just learning or whether you're here tonight to expand what you're already doing, we need you, and we're excited to have you here. So Desiree already started by demonstrating beautifully this case about the need for native plants and the importance of insects and food webs. And so I wanted to continue to build on that, making the case for insects and their their unique behaviors, their ecological roles, and the challenges that they face. And then two, I want to talk about how we can support insects, how we can garden for butterflies and moths. And finally, I'll just end with a few brief anecdotes about what's been successful. So I'll argue first that insects are valuable in their own right. They're fascinating, they're diverse, and they engage in some spectacular behaviors. We know that bees, for example, have social behaviors, and some insects make homes, like wasps. And my favorite behavior from insects is their long-distance migration, like Elmer mentioned. And so to talk about long-distance migration, of course, I have to start with the monarch butterfly. I studied these for the past 8 years, starting at the University of Georgia. And it's been a pleasure to study them because they're these small creatures. They weigh half a gram. And as you already know, they engage in these spectacular migrations. And I've also been surprised and delighted by people's interest in this species and their willingness to put new plants in their yard to help this species. And so to give you a little bit of background, to add to what you already know about monarchs, there are 3 populations of monarchs in North America. There's the western population, and they travel a short distance every fall to the coast of California. And there's the South Florida population, which doesn't migrate at all. And then there's the eastern migratory population of monarchs, as we know about, and that's what we have here in Maryland. And what happens in the fall with these critters, I'm sure you're aware, as their host plants, milkweed, die back in the fall, the monarchs leave for Mexico. And they go to the same 14 or so mountaintops every year. Oh, we're going to have a mic check. Thank you, Mark. They go to the same 14 or so mountaintops every year, and they've never been to these locations before. It was their previous great-great-grandparents the previous year that had made it to those sites. And yet somehow they find these mountaintops every year, and it's still a mystery to scientists. When they go, they travel over 2,500 miles, and they cluster in these Eulemel fir trees. And sometimes they do so densely that you can see the orange in these forests from an aircraft. So all of the orange there is just butterfly wings. They gather by the millions there, and they blanket the fir trees. And these are a special microclimate here because it's cold enough so that the monarchs can conserve their metabolism during a really hard time, during the winter when they're not getting nectar. But it's also protected enough from the winter so that they usually don't freeze. So these are very important locations that they have to find. In the spring, of course, like right now, the monarchs come out of their semi-dormant state. They wake up, mate, and then they return to us in the United States and eventually to Canada. And so what we have now, since it's April, monarchs are on their way. They're moving through Texas. They're moving through Oklahoma. Some are actually coming up from Florida. And has anybody seen a monarch this season yet? I would be surprised if you had, because they're taking their time. You'll probably start seeing them in May or June. Does anybody know when they are likely to appear here? July? Okay, that's good to know. So it's pretty late. So what you're seeing there is probably the children or the great-grandchildren, or the grandchildren of these monarchs that spent their time in Mexico. And they come just as the milkweed starts to sprout. And so as I mentioned, monarchs in North America migrate to survive harsh winters. But we also learned in working with citizen scientists that they're migrating for another reason, and that's to escape parasites. Parasites, yes. And so primarily the reason is for the winter, but they have this added benefit of escape from this parasite called Ophriocistis electroscura. Monarchs get pathogens just like we do, and this is a specialist pathogen that only monarchs can get, and it's probably co-evolved with monarchs for a long time, so this is not a new thing that they've been dealing with. When a monarch is sick with this parasite, they'll be covered on the outside of their abdomen with millions of these dormant spores. They're kind of football-shaped. And in that microscope image, you can see the scales from the monarch's body, the large structures, and then the small parasites peppered throughout. So there might be millions of these on the outside of the monarch's body. This parasite is transmitted when an infected adult monarch goes to a milkweed and lays eggs, deposits some spores on the milkweed, and then they're consumed by a caterpillar. So transmission is always from adult to milkweed to caterpillar. And once the parasites are inside the caterpillar, they start to replicate at the chrysalis stage. And you can see under this chrysalis some dark patches. Those are parasites starting to replicate on the outside of that monarch's body. And sometimes it's so severe that the monarchs get stuck in the chrysalis and they don't survive past this stage. But other times, and most of the time, the infections are more mild. And so the monarch will survive, but it will not live as long as a healthy monarch, and it won't be able to fly as well as a healthy monarch. So in 2006, my graduate advisor, Sonia Altizer, at the University of Georgia, wanted to track this parasite across the country. But she needed more people than just in her lab, and so she started a citizen science project called Monarch Help. And this is a project where people can sample monarchs in their own yard by taking a clear piece of sticker and sticking it on that monarch's abdomen. And it's a very brief procedure. It doesn't harm the butterflies in any way. And the samples are then sent to our lab at the University of Georgia for analysis. We look under the microscope, and we're able to share those results with volunteers. And since this program started, they've collected over 30,000 samples across the country. And we've been able to study and recognize some really interesting patterns. And one of them was that volunteers from this program helped to show that the number of monarchs infected every year rises during the summer breeding period and then goes back down after they migrate. And we saw this pattern year after year, with a rise in infection level and then a decrease after the migration. And what this indicated was that the migration of the monarchs actually helps to reduce parasite prevalence in the population every year. And so this was a really remarkable finding and helped us to realize the mechanisms through which this might be happening. And so if you imagine monarchs breeding during the summer, there is an accumulation of these OE parasites on the milkweed plants. But then when they go to Mexico in the fall, they benefit by leaving this habitat behind. The milkweeds die back, and the monarchs benefit from this, and this is called migratory escape from the pathogen. And so for part of the year, they have no exposure to that pathogen. In addition, if you think about infected monarchs going to Mexico, it's kind of like running a marathon with the flu. Some of them will not do well, and they'll be eliminated from the population. And this is bad for that individual, but really good for the population as a whole. So what we end up with is this process called migratory culling of infected individuals. And by the time they make it to Mexico, the monarchs are in a healthier population state. The prevalence of OE has gone down, and this happens every year. So we've learned that the insect migration that they engage in is really important for their health. And this wouldn't have been possible without citizen scientists. So when I was learning about this at the University of Georgia, I was also reading, and I was reading that other insects migrate too. And this is something we almost never talk about. We know that monarchs are famous for this migration, but in fact, hundreds of other insect species also migrate. And these include other butterflies like buckeyes, which we have here. These include some tropical species of butterflies, green darner dragonflies, and even some bee species. And we also have learned in the past 10 or so years that these insect migrations are more abundant and more diverse than we ever had imagined as scientists. So if you think about monarchs, there are hundreds of millions of them every year. But something like desert locusts, there are 80 million per square kilometer in northern Africa. They're also a migratory species. And when we looked at these species, my colleagues looked at these species across an entire continent in the southern UK, they found that in the southern UK, every year, over 3 trillion insects are making seasonal journeys across species. And so this is way more abundant than we even knew. It's happening at high altitudes, sometimes at night, and then we've used weather radar and other radar methods to discover this. So insects are really engaging in these amazing behaviors we had no idea about until recent years. Diverse species are involved in these migrations. I mentioned moths and butterflies like Lepidoptera, also dragonflies, like in the Odonata group, and some lady beetles and some hoverflies, and across 9 different taxonomic orders. And some of these migrations are really amazing. In addition to the monarchs, there are 9 Danaid species in Taiwan, and these butterflies move 300 kilometers south on the island, and they cluster in a place called the Purple Butterfly Valley, which just sounds magical to me. They cluster in these mixed species aggregations, and they spend the winter there and then return north, similar to the monarchs, but it's a much shorter journey. And then I just wanted to highlight one more finding that we found. My colleagues in the UK found that insects can actually selectively use winds to make their migrations. So about 100 years ago, entomologists doubted the insects could migrate at all. We thought they might be able to move a few miles. And then later we said, okay, well, a few can move a little bit, but they're just haphazardly blown around by the winds. That's what we assumed. But that's wrong. That is actually not the case. For larger-bodied species of insects, they're selectively choosing winds, like the silver Y moth, which is a beautiful species in the United Kingdom. If they want to move north in the spring, they wait for a northward wind, find the right altitude that's moving at the fastest rate, and in that way, taking advantage of the winds, they can move 650 kilometers a night, which is just as fast as migratory birds. So I've made the case for their inherent value just in some of their specific behaviors like migration, these really spectacular things about their natural histories. But I want to talk too about their ecological value. And Desiree made a wonderful case for this, so I will not add too much more here, but just to touch on a few points. We know that insects are ecologically critical. And when you look at an insect, you might not think that this is something that collectively is worth $57 billion a year in ecosystem services across insects around the world. But it's true. They're providing ecosystem services for us for free, and these are pollination, decomposition, nutrient cycling, control of other insect species for the predaceous ones, and of course food webs, like Desiree talked about. And we often think that, well, insects are bad, right? But actually only 1% of insect species cause any problems for humans. The other 99% of insects are probably doing services for us or contributing to the animals' food webs that we love. And this is the reason why E.O. Wilson has called these the little things that run the world. So we know that insects are deeply embedded in food webs. We learned about birds. I'll just mention they also support bats, of course. This is one example. Brazilian or Mexican free-tailed bats rely on cabbage loopers, corn earworm moths, fall armyworm moths, and in this one particular study, they showed that Mexican free-tailed bats in Texas would gain weight as all of these migratory moths moved through the area because they were gorging on these moths every night. And of course, we can't ignore the insects or pollinators. In the United States, insects across species provide $15 billion worth of pollination services, and most of that is from exotic honeybees, but $3 billion of that money is from native species of bees, of moths, and butterflies that are completely doing this for free for us. And of course, much of what we eat is because of pollinators. And we think that 1 out of every 3 bites is because of a pollinating animal. Half of our pollination is from exotic honeybees, but we think that the other half is due to wild insects. And so this is pretty amazing finding that they only found in the past 10 years or so. We have not given wild insects enough credit in the past for pollination. And then lastly, I'll just mention that insects contribute to nutrient cycling. For healthy ecosystems, we need nitrogen and carbon cycling and phosphorus cycling, and insects contribute to this as herbivores, and also when they deposit their carcasses on the earth. They're made up of 10% nitrogen and 1% phosphorus. As we've talked about, they're really nutritious, and they're involved not only in food webs, but in nutrient cycling. So we've talked about how insects are inherently valuable, how they're ecologically valuable, but despite this, we're now facing serious insect declines around the globe. And to give you an example of this, I'll just talk about the monarchs again briefly. In 2013, in the Midwest, I was trying to do a project on monarch butterflies, and I went out to collect and look at milkweed. And of course, as you know, monarchs will go from egg to caterpillar to pupa to adult, and I was looking for these first 2 stages, the eggs and caterpillars, on milkweeds, but you should be able to find maybe 1 every 50 milkweed species. You should find a caterpillar. And we searched sites first in Cleveland, Ohio. You can see the milkweed popping up on the side of the road here. We searched hundreds of plants and did not find any caterpillars in that summer of 2013. We then went to this site in Indiana. Again, same thing, 150 more plants, nothing. We went to another site in Michigan. It took us 3 days to find our first monarch caterpillar, which we finally did. Here he is. We named him Kurt. Actually, we were so thrilled to find him. Scientists don't usually name their study species, but we were elated. And we ended up finding a few more monarchs that season, but it actually wasn't enough to even complete the project. I had to take that out of my dissertation because there simply were not enough monarchs on the landscape in that year. And it turns out that 2013, we learned later that year, was the worst year on record for monarch numbers. And you might remember this because this was in the news. Scientists in Mexico every year look at the overwintering colonies. They measure them in terms of the number of hectares or acres covered by monarchs in Mexico. And they started this in 1994. And you can see the drastic decline over the past 20 years. In 2013, the numbers hit rock bottom at just half a hectare. And most recently, this past season, they hit about three hectares. So we're starting to see some bouncing numbers, but it's all pretty low. And so entomologists are used to seeing numbers go up and down with insects. But what concerns us is this decline that's so obvious over the past 20 years. And unfortunately, this problem is not restricted to monarchs. It's part of a much larger problem with insects and pollinators around the globe. Most recently, a study came out a couple of months ago from Germany that said that 76% of our insects in terms of biomass has declined in the past 30 years or so. So that's 76% less insect biomass on the landscape. That was in Germany. But this kind of study has been supported over and over and over again across Europe and other temperate areas around the globe. And so we're seeing a decline that's pretty serious. And if you look at just lepidopterans and butterflies and moths around the globe, you can see that since the 1970s, we have had a decline in lepidopterans of about 35% in abundance. So if you're imagining that you're seeing fewer butterflies and moths in your yard, it's because you are seeing fewer butterflies and moths in your yard. But I will say that I have a lot of hope about this issue. And there are several reasons why, because it can start with our yards, and we have a lot of power to change our yards, as Desiree talked about, to shift things towards native species, to provide more plants for caterpillars, and of course birds. And I have a lot of hope about this for a couple of different reasons. And one is because people are interested in doing this. I think that there's a lot of interest. There was a survey that was done on monarch butterflies, and it showed that 24% of American households actually want milkweed in their yards. That's an amazing number, and maybe only 4% of us actually do have it in our yards. It might be an access problem, or people aren't making the time for it, but there's that potential and there's that interest that we can tap into. The other thing I will say is that once insects are given habitat, they can rebound quickly. So I think this is something that we can reverse if we start talking to people, if we start changing our yards, and we realize as a society the need for native plants and for insects. And so I want to spend just the last few minutes of the talk talking about how we can actually support insects in our yards with gardening for butterflies and moths. And you might already have a lot of knowledge about this, and if so, I'd love to hear some of your input as we have questions at the end. So we've talked a lot about the need for native species and a diversity of species. So I think the best thing we can do is focus on that. And then in addition, try to get both host species of plants and nectar species. And as we know, caterpillars eat host plants. So they are specialized, as Desiree talked about, so just a few species in most cases. And then the adult moths and butterflies, they're much less picky. They'll find nectar in a lot of different places. So if you're just starting out butterfly gardening, a great place to start is milkweeds because they support a few species in addition to monarchs. And in this area, you're probably already familiar with common milkweed, which you see along roadsides and paths, with swamp milkweed, and with butterfly milkweed. How many people already have milkweed in their yard or in their neighborhood? That's great. That's wonderful to see. So you already are familiar with this plant and you know what kind of butterfly life it can bring. And I think we're going to have an opportunity, is that right, tomorrow morning, Elmer, to buy plants?
Yeah, I will be mentioning it at the transition.
Okay, great. I'm pointing out here, I have handouts for this if you're interested, more migratory butterflies that are in our area, in the mid-Atlantic region. These are just a handful. We have a lot of butterflies that migrate through our area. We don't know much about their movements, actually. But just to point out a few, American ladies, painted ladies as well, cloudless sulfurs, common buckeyes, question marks, mourning cloaks, and red admirals. They're all migratory species, and they often move hundreds of kilometers down the East Coast in the fall and back up the East Coast in the spring. And we can support their journeys with planting these host plants, and as well as nectar plants. Just to point out a few nectar sources for the adult butterflies and moths. This is just a handful of possibilities. False blue indigo is a really beautiful plant. Bee balm, of course, which is appealing to wild bees and also to butterflies. And many aster species are very important. Cardinal flower, you're probably familiar with, is attractive to hummingbirds and to butterflies. Black-eyed Susans and goldenrods. Doug Tallamy's work has shown that goldenrods are extremely important for lepidopterans. So contrary to our aversion for it, it's actually not that linked with as allergies as we once thought. It's helpful to butterflies. And Joe Pyeweed, which is a taller species. Two more, purple coneflower and phlox. And this is from Doug Tallamy's book, and this shows, just as Desiree had started to show us with trees, the number of herbaceous plants and the number of species that they support. And so I hope you can see this okay. I'll just read it a little bit. Goldenrod supports 115 species of lepidopterans, asters 112, sunflower 73, Joe Pyeweed 42, and the rest of the list supports fewer as you go down. Milkweed supports 12, which we always talk about monarchs, but they're supporting other species as well. And then I think, as Desiree emphasized, the need for trees and shrubs is very serious. So one of the best things we can do with a butterfly garden is make sure we have those trees and shrubs in our yard, or plant them if we don't. In addition to focusing on the beautiful flowers, so we talked about oaks and black cherries and willows. These are all wonderful species to plant, supporting hundreds, literally, of species of lepidopterans, and of course, birds. And we didn't get a chance to talk about invasive species as much today, but I understand that mile-a-minute and English ivy and multiflora rose and other species in this area are of concern. And I think people here in this room have a lot of knowledge about this. And so one step in butterfly gardening is removing these species so that native species can take over themselves. And then I think one thing that's helpful to note is that you can start small. You can expand your butterfly garden and reduce your lawn size, but you don't have to go all out in your first year. You can start small. You can minimize pesticide use, and this, of course, is critical for butterfly caterpillars. Once you've seen a butterfly caterpillar get pesticide poisoning, you never want to see it again. And so you can rely, as you get more diversity of plants in your habitat, you get more diverse plants and more diverse caterpillars, and you'll also get more diverse predators. And these are natural predators that will help you with pest control. Lacewings eat a lot of aphids, and so do lady beetles. This is a convergent lady beetle. Green darner dragonflies eat some larger species, and praying mantises. These are just a few examples of native predators that can help us with pests. There's also been a recent study talking about just mowing your lawn less frequently on a multi-week cycle rather than every other week, or whatever is best for your area. And so finally, I just wanted to end with a couple of stories of success that really inspire me. And the first is of Chuck Patterson and his wife Patricia Patterson in Austin, Texas. They live in these ranch lands in Texas. That's their home. They, about 6 years ago, discovered monarch butterflies moving through their area. And they had no idea about this before, but they happened to notice these monarchs one year. This is actually a monarch in his area on a thistle from Mexico. You can see that it's clearly been through months of winter. And it's amazing that he got to see this, and he realized where they were coming from, and he started thinking his area might be important for monarchs. So he started cultivating milkweed in his yard and talking to his neighbors. And I wish you could see his yard. It's beautiful, it's full of wildlife, and he talks to his neighbors frequently about what that means to him and what they can do in their yards. And so he's become a wonderful pollinator advocate. Another story of success comes from our Monarch Health volunteers. We worked with hundreds of people across the country, and without them, we wouldn't have noticed some very key things that have been important for monarch conservation and monarch habitat. And one of those things was volunteers helped us to recognize that exotic tropical milkweed, like in this bottom picture here on the right, actually caused monarchs to have health problems and in the coastal areas, and actually contributed to higher disease levels of the OE parasite that I mentioned earlier. And so we wouldn't have known this without citizen scientists. And they've been able to figure this out, and with their help, we've been able to talk to people and say, we need to keep planting milkweed for monarchs, and we need to keep it native, because the seasonality of that milkweed is important and supports the monarchs' migration to Mexico. And if we keep the migration, we can help maintain their health. So that's been a really important message. And then the last story I wanted to mention is Marty and Jean Webb in Houston, Texas. They have an amazing story as well, where they started being interested in pollinators. They have, again, a beautiful yard in their area in Houston, Texas. But they did something really amazing. They started a school for children with neurological differences called the Monarch School in Houston. It has amazing educators. I had the privilege of working at this school with the students as a field site. But what's amazing about this location is that it's full of milkweed, and they've recognized, Marty and Jean Webb, the value of connecting the students with monarchs on a daily basis. They go out, the students take walks, and they get to interact with the butterflies, look at milkweed plants, and the connection with communities has been really important for Marty and Jean Webb and for their school. And so I'm inspired by these stories. Chuck Patterson being a neighborhood advocate for pollinators, with a citizen scientist contributing to science directly, and with Marty and Jean Webb, who connected people with these pollinators. So in closing, I hope that Desiree and I have argued that insects are worth preserving because they engage in these spectacular behaviors. They're beautiful in their own right. They're ecologically critical. They're absolutely important for food webs. They also contribute to decomposition and nutrient cycling and pollination. And as insects suffer severe declines, we can effect real change for wildlife in our own backyards and revive local wildlife communities. And thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure to talk with you today. I'd also like to thank my collaborators at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center and at the University of Georgia and my funding partners. Thank you.
Why don't you just raise your hand if you have a question, and then we'll bring mine to you. Here's a question over here.
Yes, this question is for Desiree.
Hi.
Talk a lot about the trees that are important. We have a very small yard, we can't plant very many trees.
Yeah.
What kind of shrubs would be good that we could plant? There'd be a lot of caterpillars and birds and that kind of.
Sure. That's a great question. So, so in my work, when I say woody plants, we were counting both the trees and the shrubs. And so there are a lot of woody shrubs that can provide lots of food for birds, like things like viburnums. Southern arrowwood is extremely productive, but it also has fruit and it also has flowers. It's kind of like a trifecta amazing plant. I really love it, viburnum. There are smaller, I'm trying to think of some other shrub. Lilacs are non-native, so I feel a little bit on the spot, so I can't think of the other ones. What was that?
Shooting cherries,
They're non-native too. Well, so that makes me think, there's also, so I get this a lot where people are like, okay, oaks are really productive, but I don't have room for an oak tree. They're gigantic. And there are cultivars that are out there where people have selectively bred native species, they're called nativars, to be smaller or to be a different, like our red maples that have really red leaves. And so for some species of trees, you can get dwarf varieties and you can prune them so that they stay smaller, so that they don't grow into a giant oak tree. So that's what I would suggest. There's also some shrub versions of trees. Like for instance, there was chestnut tree, but there's also, which we don't have anymore, but there's also dwarf chestnut that is shrub. And there's some other ones that I'll try to think of and I'll share with you. But if you go on that website, maybe we can put that website up there because I think it's really, really useful.
Yeah, one thing, all the websites that were in her presentation, we're going to have a page on the city's website, I should say, where this information will be available for you to extract when you have the time to get to a computer to go further searching. Another thing I wanted to add, just on the trees and shrubs, we were able to, the Garden Club was able to secure a number of what are called dwarf Chinquapin oaks, which a lot of people will say, well, I don't have room for an oak. In fact, Gay always says that, and I searched and found a good source, and we have about 20 of those little guys, and they would fit perfect in a yard. And
they don't grow that big.
No.
Are those for sale tomorrow? I think?
Yes, yes.
There's a question here that doesn't want to use
So Doug and I have discussed this. Every time he has a talk, I say, I'm looking for this oak to get you off my back. Crinoides is supposed to finish out in like 8 to 12 feet. Licifolia, the same thing. But you said that there are some marked differences between some of the varieties where the caterpillars tell the difference, the birds, am I valid in spending the last 10 years of my life looking for Quercus crinoides? Because I have no room in my yard for big oaks, but I could tuck some of these babies in there, and they're shrubby, so they should have almost the same biomass.
Yeah, what's the common name? I'm not familiar with
That's
that.
the dwarf chickadee.
That's the Chickadees?
The
Yeah,
dwarf
so,
chickadee, but it's Quercus crinoides.
okay. So when I was saying that there's differences between the different kinds, for that analysis, it's just like native versions of oaks, non-native versions of oaks. So, and I should also add that for all of this work, we use a really conservative, I guess it's conservative, definition of native. So we consider something native if it has a distribution that's anywhere in the eastern United States. So the things that we're calling non-native are really stuff that are like Asian, or from Europe, or from, there's a couple of things that are only on the west coast of the United States. So if someone is like, well, I mean, Chickapin oak isn't really found in the Piedmont or in the coastal region of Maryland, it probably doesn't make that much of a difference. So I would say, yes, plant it, but stay away from things that are the non-native versions. The reason that these non-native versions are here are because people that are trying to make money in horticulture are like, well, we really like cherries, but we don't want things biting on them. We don't want things chewing on them. So they brought over all these, non-native versions because they didn't want insects on them. And so that's kind of made these changes in our ecosystem. So we want to bring that back. The bugs are okay. And like Dara said, when you have a healthy insect population, you also have healthy predators keeping them down so that you don't see them quite as much. So you're okay. You do you. Right?
Has there been much research comparing I don't know the terms really, but locally, local native plants that are naturally occurring versus native plants that are planted from, that follow that looser definition?
Mm-hmm.
And sort of a corollary to that is, why do you think, you mentioned chickadees that lived in backyards or that nested in backyards, had accessibility to woods nearby where there were suitable plant species and insects presumably. Do you have any theories as to why they did not utilize that resource?
Okay, so the first question was about the comparing native and maybe not so locally. So I can't think of
Naturally occurring.
Yeah. I can't think of a study offhand that's looked at that fine of a detail of what we would consider native, but I can tell you that one of Doug's students has looked at cultivars, so a native species that we've selectively bred for either leaf color, maybe we selectively bred it to be shaped in a different way, or variegation, or fruit, lots of fruit. And he did find that there were differences, but it depended on what type of trait we were selectively breeding for. But for the most part, we were finding more herbivores, caterpillars, as well as leafhoppers and other things on the native plants, or on the true wild natives.
Ecotypes that were
But only if we were breeding for color, like leaf color. And the reason for that is because leaf color is chemically based. But everything else that we breed for, fruit, structure, leaf shape, none of that matters. It was very, very similar. So you can go to your local nursery, and even if they're selling they have like a fancy name, they'll be like Morning Glory, those are okay. And the second question is why might they be avoiding forests? So I have two hypotheses. One is that it's actually, I think neighborhoods are pretty safe for a small bird with dependent young because there's more Cooper's hawks in the forest. And so if you think about it, there may be fewer predators in this urban environment. And these chickadees are flying, so cats really aren't a big problem for them. It's really the avian predators. But somebody that was speaking to me earlier over there brought up competition, and I think that's something to think about too. So if you go into the forest, there's going to be more migratory species, more insectivorous species, more birds in general than maybe perhaps in the neighborhood. And so that could be that they're avoiding that competition by taking advantage of locations that other birds would never use, like a gas station.
So, during the research, did you have any issues with house sparrows, for example, trying to take over the chickadee nests or any other type of non-native bird?
That's a great question. I feel like I planted that question. We did not have any trouble with house sparrows because the tubes that we made we made the holes small enough so that house sparrows couldn't get in. So that keeps out most of the other cavity competitors, as well as larger predators like maybe a squirrel or things like that. But the species that could get inside was the house wren, which is our #1 predator in the system. They are a big cavity competitor. They are a native species. We like them. They're good. But they will come in, they migrate from the southern United States, and they come back and they're like, ooh, this is a nice tube, I want this. So they take all the nest material out, and then they take it over. If there's eggs, they will poke holes in the eggs. And so that was the #1, predator. It's not really a predator, competitor in our system. If I had a bigger team, I would have started a whole new project on house wrens because I had so many. But yeah. So.
What kind of rates of, do you know what the rate of taking over?
Taking over. So our nest success rate for chickadees was about 70%, 60 to 70%, that they would fledge at least one. And we would have a spattering of predators, snakes or so, maybe a mouse that got into a nest. I don't know the number off the top of my head how many, but I do think there's interesting questions going forward, because there were some yards where we would have a house wren and a chickadee in the same yard, and everything was glorious, and nobody bothered anyone. And then there were other yards where the house wren would, even if it had its own nest, it would, break all the, or destroy all the nests around it. And this is other birds too. So like we've documented house wrens destroying cardinal nests, catbird nests, all kinds of things. So, yeah.
There's a question.
What role do bird feeders play in supplementing, or do they actually compete with native species if you don't have a wide variety of them in your yard?
Bird feeders. The bird feeder question is a great question. One of the main things that people do to provide for wildlife is to have a feeder, and feeders are excellent because that's where I first learned about birds. My son right now, he's 1.5 years, and he sees the birds coming with a feeder, and he's like, oh, chickadee. So in our system, almost every yard had bird feeders. So we didn't control for feeders because they're basically ubiquitous in the landscape. One of the things we found from color banding them is that our homeowners would say, well, the only reason I have birds in my yard is because I have a feeder. But the chickadees that were actually breeding weren't going to the feeder at all during the breeding season. The chickadees that were coming to the feeder were all kinds of other individuals. And what feeders probably do is increase survival of birds that wouldn't otherwise survive, and increasing the population size. So they definitely are beneficial to birds, but not in a way that they need the bird seed. So if you took your bird seed away, your birds would be okay. They would find other food in the winter. They actually, for chickadees, 50% of their diet is insects in the winter, because our insects have to overwinter. So this is a really long way of saying it has some effect, but not a huge effect.
I guess I have a follow-up to what you just mentioned, because we get into this discussion a lot of times about how you should maintain your yard with regard to decaying matter on the surface, leaves, and the mentioning of the insects overwintering. Could you talk about that connection and where that goes?
Sure, yeah. We know that a lot of insects overwinter in leaf litter. You're probably aware of that. And so keeping the leaf litter around is important. Keeping it in your landscape is important.
Hugely important. It's something that I hope to look at in the near future, because a lot of these yards that I go into, and even my own, the amount of leaf litter that we keep is so little. But then if you do keep a little bit and then you open it up, it's moist, and there's springtails, and there's overwinter beetles, and there's pupae, and there's all kinds of stuff going on there. So, yeah.
Here's a question about tent caterpillars.
Oh, they're native.
And Bud,
Yeah.
both of you have a comment, either of you?
Oh, yeah.
So, do you want to start? Yeah, tent caterpillars are a pain, man. They tend to like cherry trees. So, I guess what I want to say about tent caterpillars is that trees can be resilient. So I know that especially in like the gardening circuits, there's a lot of push to use pesticides for tent caterpillars. But tent caterpillars, they're not gypsy moths. They do have populations that go up and down, so there might be like really bad year, but then maybe the next year isn't so bad. But keep in mind, if you use pesticides, which we don't want to use, you're killing everything. You're not just killing tent caterpillars. And there are some birds that do eat tent caterpillars. Cuckoos.
What kind?
Huh?
What kind of
What kind of
bird
birds?
eat them?
Cuckoos and Baltimore orioles have been observed eating tent caterpillars. House sparrows have actually been reported eating tent caterpillars. The thing is that there's so much hair. It's like they're like, I don't really want to.
Same thing for bagworms?
Bagworms, like evergreen bagworms. Yeah, they have their own special defense, don't they? I don't know of anything that eats bagworms. Yeah.
I have a question.
If you do want to pick them off and then you throw them in the woods, you're not going to make any effect on the population. And with the tent caterpillars, they start coming out, like they're probably out now down here, but up in Delaware, they're just starting to come out in their first and second instars, so that would be the time to control them. Maybe cut that branch and maybe throw it in the woods somewhere.
So I've got a question about the
Sorry.
parasites.
I don't know how to speak.
Are they just a problem for the northern population, or does the western and the Florida populations also
Yeah,
not
good
infected?
question. We think that parasite he's mentioning, the OE parasite, it affects all populations of monarchs around the globe, actually. So it's probably co-evolved with them for a very long time. And they seem to be most likely affected in places where they don't migrate. So we're trying to keep monarchs migrating to keep the numbers down.
How do the ones that don't migrate?
Yeah, so there's a population in South Florida, as I mentioned, that they don't migrate, and we're now starting to see more and more monarchs not migrate in the Gulf Coast because of exotic milkweed and possibly warmer temperatures. And they get really high levels of OE. Some monarchs in South Florida have tried to live with it a little bit. They have a tiny bit of resistance and tolerance to the parasite, but they still suffer from it. And in the Gulf Coast areas, the monarchs there are probably not adapted to deal with really high levels of parasites yet. So we're trying to encourage native milkweeds, which are naturally synchronized with the monarch life cycle. They die back when the monarchs go south, and they re-sprout when the monarchs come back north.
When I asked to say something, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. You're good.
And no, first, when is the locust coming back again? They come back every, what is it, 14 years or 17 years?
The locust, right?
Yeah, those big ones.
Yes, periodical locusts will come back on different cycles, 13 years.
Yeah, I see some even last summer. I saw some.
Yes.
But it's interesting to see how the birds get those. And
Oh,
they're very
yes.
nutritious. Yeah. And also the chipmunks. It's really funny because they scream. The locusts scream.
They
the chipmunk
do.
just, yeah.
Yeah, they're fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Last year was a 4-year celebration of 17-year cicadas. The rest of Route 10 will be back here in 2021. They're totally harmless, they don't kill anything. Leave them alone, we're doing enough with development wiping them out.
Thank you for that.
There'll be millions of them.
My God.
Okay, let's take one more question if we could.
I had a question about the native versus the non-native milkweed and other plants that they sell at the garden center. Because I had purchased some milkweed, which I thought were natives, but especially after seeing your slide, it looked just like what I had purchased. And I was told at another garden center, no, that's a tropical species and it actually will hurt the population and not help the population. So I guess my question is, how can you be sure you're getting the native variety of the plants that you want to support the particular species that is the host plant for that particular species? How are you sure you're getting the native versus the non-native species?
Great.
Because some garden centers do not label them correctly.
That's exactly right. I found quite a few garden centers that will label them something else, like they might call it scarlet milkweed, or they might call it like royal milkweed. They'll make up a name, and they'll call it native, but it's actually still tropical milkweed. And that's an exotic species. It's Asclepias curassavica. And so this species, I guess, there's probably only one other species that looks like this plant, and that's Asclepias tuberosa, the butterfly milkweed. Both of them have orange flowers. The butterfly milkweed is native, and the exotic milkweed is tropical milkweed. They both have orange flowers, but look for the fuzziness on the leaves in that case. If they're orange and they have fuzzy leaves, you're okay. That's butterfly milkweed. And then just knowing the scientific name sometimes helps for just a few species. You don't need to memorize names, but Asclepias curassavica is the exotic name. So
Can you spell that?
Yeah, it's Curassavica. It's curassavica.
And tuberosa is the native?
Tuberosa is the native, and they do look similar. They're both orange.
That's impressive. I have a comment that's just, because identifying plants is hard. And I learned that when I first started my project, because I was like, I'm going to study birds and caterpillars. And then I was like, oh wait, actually most of what I do is identify plants that I've never seen before. And one of the things that I learned is that the big box stores don't really know what they have. And so if you go to, I'm not going to name any names, but if you go there and you say, oh, I want a native species, they'll say, yeah, that sounds native to me, right? So smaller nurseries may have a lot more information for you that could be more useful. And like Dara says, you double checking that scientific name, just like Google it real quick to see whether it's truly native. That can be helpful. And then there's two websites that are really useful for plant ID. One is the Missouri, do you know what I'm talking about?
Botanical Gardens?
Yeah, Missouri Botanical Gardens is a great database where they have information about the native origin of like every horticultural species that you could think of, and cultivars and hybrids, so much info. The other cool website that I was telling someone earlier is this website called iNaturalist. And they have a cool new algorithm where you can take a picture of something and it'll give you suggestions for what that thing is. So if you took a picture of your milkweed and then uploaded it to iNaturalist, it'll say, hey, this looks like a milkweed. I think this is tropical. And so that might be a cool thing to play with too.
Is it I, the letter I, or EYE?
Oh, letter I, like iPod, but naturalist.com. It's really fun.
We have one person who urgently wants to ask a quick question. I'll let you if you can be short on it.
We'll be sure. Oh,
Is it harmful for the birds if you throw out stale bread?
Oh, yeah, bread's not good. It's filler with no nutritious calories. So they might go to it, but it's going to bind up their system if they eat too much of it. And unfortunately, birds might, if not, they might eat too much. So I would not throw out bread. I would maybe throw something out a little bit more nutritious, like either birdseed or mealworms or suet or something.
Okay, a couple quick things to follow up that last question before that one. The plant sale tomorrow, we are going to have the two principal milkweeds that are here that the monarch depends on. Common is by far the workhorse for the monarch. And we'll have those, and also swamp milkweed, where it's available, is very much preferred and is probably a nicer ornamental. It can be short-lived. That's the only thing I would say, and I've worked with it for a number of years, so that's why tuberosa does not grow very well in this part of the state. It needs very dry soil, and that's the butterfly weed. Western Maryland, it grows on shale banks, but here it doesn't like our soils at all. And again, if you can't get to the plant sale, we're going to have 18 really true regional pollinator plants that are long-lived, along with the top 3 listed on Doug Talmey's for starter plants. We have an oak, I have some willow starters, some little twigs that, you know, it's a great project with kids to plant an oak stick or willow stick and grow it into a tree. We'll have some of those. And they all 3, I have 3 different varieties that are native to the East Coast, including pussy willow. I grew up with pussy willow. I had to have pussy willow every spring. So we have those. And the third one is we have a couple different, I have black cherries, which I know a lot of people don't like, but it's a good tree in terms of nature. And I also have choke cherries, which are, again, a wonderful cherry. So we're trying to fulfill that need, but if you can't get to the plant sale, I have a list of the native plant. It's not inclusive, but it has a lot of places you can get native plants within Maryland. Both nurseries that are dependable and, you know, don't have that situation you unfortunately encountered, and plant sales. And that gets back to another issue that was brought up. A lot of the plant sales are trying to get people to grow ecotype, you know, within that region. Ursanga does that. Chesapeake Natives, my understanding, does that. So, and they're in Upper Marlboro. You know, you can almost throw a rock to them. So there are other places, but be sure to grab one of these. A couple other real quick things. Like I said, the plant sale coming up tomorrow. Lots of really good stuff to help pollinators we're going to have there, and to the birds. If you still are uncertain about, do I really want a pollinator garden or some native plants, I'm doing a very in-depth talk on Saturday, May the 5th, on how you can have pollinators anywhere, virtually, you know, on your patio. I convinced my dentist, because he said he has shade and I couldn't grow anything, to plant milkweed in a pot and put it on his patio so that he would be able to have monarchs. And you can do that with a ton of the native plants. You know, we have a mindset you can't, you know, natives are native and they have to be out somewhere, not in my backyard or not on my patio. They can be on your patio. You know, the other thing is we have different conditions that determine what you plant. I have on the Bowie Crofton Garden Club website the colored plates that I had out there that show, you know, what plants will tolerate wet feet, what plants have to have dry feet. You have to go through kind of those things Otherwise, you get disappointed, and we don't want you to get disappointed. We want you to be successful the first time you plant native plants. And so I have those tools out there for you. At this point, I would like to adjourn us. Thank you so much for the speakers. I think you added a tremendous amount of information. And the hope that you two conveyed in terms of the involvement of the public, I think, you know, that message needs to be taken everywhere, to everything, because that's the only way a lot of things are going to get done. On your way out, please grab any of the flyers we have out there about the programs coming up. You'll certainly enjoy it. Say again.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
I'm head of the local advisory